Dr. Power, yes,
Oh, hi, Chauncey. Coming in. I hear you're staying with us today, so have a seat. And Carrie and hi, and Mark, Jennifer's a seat for you over here. I'm glad you joined us today. This is week number 6, 2 to go. We're on the homeward stretch, and I hope you're enjoying it as much as I am. I sent out to everybody, as promised, by Friday of last week, little ticklers for those that may have to pick up the pace a little bit, but not to be overly concerned, but more was possible. And I sent them some notes from the analytics set. But I reviewed everybody's, and I'm satisfied that stay on track, and you'll be all right for the participation grade for the course. Today it's Unit 6. We're doing this transition, if you will, from the, you recall in Session 1 we talked about 2 spheres of science and of leadership, and collectively it's known as strategic management. We talked about the science of strategy, if you would, and the art of leadership, and somewhere they overlap in the center where some becomes art and some becomes science. And so today we're doing this transition from the study, from the tools, from the how-to, the science of strategy, strategic management, over to the leadership side of strategic management, where the soft skills come into play. And you can draw heavily on your leadership courses as we move forward. But we're going to quickly review things like ethics and corporate governance and some leadership concepts and notions that will help you craft and implement a strategy. Anybody can craft a strategy. You can take the tools. You can follow the waterfall method I've set out at the back of the course, the last wrap-up day that we have. Anybody can craft and put it on paper. The real skill becomes for strategists to be able to implement and roll it out. And that's where the failure takes place, is that they don't have the ability to make the plan happen. And that's a concern. We see that today. In fact, if we watch the veteran affairs in the States, they've had 2 CEOs of recent date, and both have thundered in because the ability to implement the strategy for this large organization clearly has not been shown. They don't have the wherewithal, as Colin says, to get the right bums on the bus, the wrong bums off the bus, and the right bums in the right seats. And they're now looking at a new Navy admiral coming in and taking it over, and the question is, has he got the skill sets to run this large hospital? So that was on. I've also posted on the site for you, for those interested in not-for-profit businesses and some strategic leadership in small businesses, there's a 30-minute video in the bonus section, only if you have the time. I want to be respectful of your time, but Caroline Cousson is in there, and if you want to have a look at her work and her thoughts on setting up her own organization from scratch and some of the things she's been challenged by as a strategic leader, you might find it of interest. We did Railroads Goes Global, another little context case, and the purpose of that was just to raise your awareness, appreciation that it's not about silos in strategic management. It's about incorporating all of the other disciplines. International business, for example, had to be very much part of international business. The aspect of modes of entry, of starting off first with exporting, going through the 7 modes, right straight over to greenfields, with greater risk as you transition from export to actually building your own plant on the ground, comes greater foreign direct investment risk that you have to take and where to take it and the advantages and disadvantages of each. You have to know as a strategist in designing your strategy and what the market entry strategy is going to be for going offshore. It certainly is a question. Staffing is another thing. At HR and leadership, we talk in terms of ethnocentric and polycentric and geocentric, and your HR strategy and what it's going to be when you take your business offshore. So we can't lose sight of just this silo of strategy, but it's bringing together all of the things you've learned as you go through this program in together to do your final EL2 that I designed and you folks will be doing at the end of your program. This week, you've submitted to me your papers. Thank you. I should have them all back to you by the time you see this on Monday. Generally very pleased with the efforts from everybody. Good job, and it was just a practice to get you ready for this. Next 2 weeks as you go towards your individual assignment. It's the beer case, case number 7, that you're going to do that for me and have a look at it as individuals. And it takes me some time. I'll give individual feedback to each one of the 40 of you. It takes me some time to prepare that. But I'll have it to you before the last day of course, so you'll have it to study and have some sense of what the camel looks like going into your exam, and the 50% of what you do will be a case study for me, and I'll share with you what that case is on the last Monday of the last week. What else is on my mind here? Intellectual capital. I want that too. I'm going to ask for all of us, it's a shame to waste the intellectual capital. You folks have worked hard on your previous 2 deliverables, and I'm sure that when you do your individual assignment, there's lots of good material in there that shouldn't be wasted. on Unit 6, you'll find a site there for uploading your assignment number 3. If you wouldn't mind, no, don't have to, but at your pleasure, but every discipline is covered, whether it be health or farming or retail or whatever. I think your colleagues would like to read it, particularly if they come from the retail section and didn't have the privilege of doing retail with their team. I think they'd like to scan your set. So unless you have some privacy concerns, and you don't have to do it, but I'd appreciate if you put them up there so we can share the intellectual capital. And I would even think they should take a copy of it because it gives them a sense of what's coming through the fog in every industry and some of the excitement that we're looking at. Oh, that was interesting. We just had one of our folks here in the room. Which one of you had your phone out? The phone just rang. Anyway, phones are off in their little sessions. Anyway, these things happen. Good stuff. Also on my mind was I've been watching and I encourage you to watch too, the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salmon, for Saudi Arabia is coming in, a young man, British educated. He's really making this transition from the kingdom, from the old world, and trying to bring it up into the new world, and is moving quickly to get some rights. I mean, not quickly enough, but moving quickly for considering the transitional changes that are taking place, to get rights for women, etc., in the system. He's transitioning away from oil to raise funds to get into some new profit centers for his nation, recognizing what's out in front for fossil fuels. He's leading coalitions of like-minded Sunni nations like Egypt to come together and fight the Houthi in Yemen. And I think what I'm reading in the tea leaves here is Trump still talking about pulling back and getting out of the Middle East to some extent. But as part of that coming out, I'm sure he's going to be encouraging Saudi allies to go in and fill the shoes of the Americans coming out. That's not firm yet, but I just have that sense that there's going to be a lot of moral suasion and pressure brought to bear on Saudi in particular and the coalition of the Saudis, Sunnis, to come in to be offset to Iran, the Shia, and their drive towards the Mediterranean through the stands in Syria, all part of that the Shanghai Cooperative Association that we've talked about. And so good just to watch on the global chessboard, the pieces move around the board, and I've got my eye on him as the way he's unfolding. I want to comment, if I can, the very heroic policeman in Toronto that took down the young man who, mentally ill, obviously, at least in my opinion, is mentally ill. Did that dastardly thing of 10 people dead, 15 injured. But it was a bad event, a troubling event, and certainly our thoughts go out to those involved. Having said that, I just was struck by the bravery of this young soldier by himself. His name was Lee. I can't recall his name off the top of my head, but his last name was Lee. But just stood there and slowly walked in, facing what appeared to be a pistol facing at him, and talked the man down to lay on the ground and be handcuffed and take away quietly. Unlike some of the scenes we see to our cousins to the States, where people just open up 10 shots and even while on the ground keep on shooting. And maybe this is part of the Canadian culture. Maybe this is a good example to show that police aren't always first off the mark to fire right away, but they put themselves in harm's way to protect us. So I nothing but admiration for the police force and for this young man who I like to think sort of typifies Canadian police. So well done to him. UVic scientists got a patent in the quest for syphilis vaccines. Interesting, of course. Nice it happens here in BC, but it leads to two things. One is the importance of us getting our own immune system up. I believe eating properly, almonds, carrots, broccoli, all that stuff we never eat. Eating that sort of stuff and getting your immune system in good shape is very valuable, and that can go a long way to defeating some of the viruses and things we come in contact. And so I certainly accept that there are vaccines needed, but I question some of them, particularly the cold one. We could have maybe a discussion over that, and I could be wrong, but for years I've not taken the cold vaccine, just a personal preference. But those are thoughts, but worth a discussion. We've got a new lieutenant governor in our province. Her name is Janet Austin. She's now in the place the earlier lieutenant governor. Retail bus data is now on the way in British Columbia. The buses are going to be equipped with lots of artificial intelligence and robotics, etc. That there'll be communications telling you at the dashboard when the next bus arrives, so you don't waste time waiting. It'll have the ability to see out ahead where the traffic is blocked and go around the obstacle to get there faster. You'll be able to track it on your little cell phones that you're all carrying, actually, when your next bus arrives to the minute. It's going to improve the efficiency, et cetera, et cetera. And it begs the question, how much longer till these things are drone-driven and not an individual behind the wheel? I don't suspect long. Empty homes tax in Vancouver. You recall we had a problem in Vancouver. I think Toronto's got the same thing of absentee landlords, and so they put in place here a tax on folks that own the properties but aren't residents. And so they expect to take in $30 million so far, and they just put it in place. They've already taken in $17 million on 8,500 properties. The properties range in value from the taxes range in value from $1,500, believe it or not, to $250,000. The tax for each year, and that was a very $25 million home, the last one. But the average is $10,000 a year extra tax for those individuals that decide they want to have a home in Vancouver and live in Alberta. That's what they're faced. So it's going to make a difference in our marketplace. And they're trying to solve affordable housing, it seems to me, on the backs of the private entrepreneur. And so it depends whether you're Plato or Aristotle how you come down on that side of it. The cost of putting this in place is going to cost the city $7.5 million to implement it, and an annual cost of about $2.5 million with audits going on and complaints and review boards. Saskatchewan has picked up on Alberta's legislation on exporting oil, and we're doing the same thing as Alberta, that we're not going to ship to BC, going to constrain, going to bring down the numbers that we ship, and we have the right to do that. Energy stocks are moving up, and artificially, because Saudi again continues to lead the coalition of oil producers, and Russia is part of that, and they are, OPEC and Russia and a few others, are artificially turning down the demand supply curve, and as a result of reducing the supply, the demand goes up and the price is going up. So it's not, in my mind, a long-term situation, as the Americans are getting ready to try to readjust that balance, because it's starting to hurt the American economy. And I was thinking just here, we talk like we have in our class, I got a brain freeze for a minute, it's not Kevin, I forget, works for WestJet, and in any event, the 25% of the bottom line inputs is fuel costs. And so when the fuel jumps from $50 a barrel to almost $70 a barrel, it makes a difference in fuel costs. But it does for across the board for all of our industries, to some extent, maybe even lesser in some, but nevertheless it's an additional cost. And that's going to impact our GMP and reduce the sales a little bit and slow down. That, combined with raising interest rates, are quite a concern. No big surprise, Ottawa posts a deficit, plans of additional deficit of $8 billion over the next 2 years. The deficit now will be somewhere up to over $22 billion this year, and a little less next year, roughly $4 billion over and above what they already estimated. And they said there's a 5% chance they'll be able to balance the budget by 2021. Well, I've heard that before. So we have a problem. We're spending more than we're taking. That's not our money. It's your children's money that we're running up. And we're doing that at these historical low interest rates. I can tell you as an old fart, interest rates at the rate they are truly a treat. We can't get addicted to them because historically, if I said an average of 5 to 7%, that's more likely what's going to be happening. And when you go like that, I think I read the story to you about the American debt and deficit in Mark Stein's book, about going from at the rates of a couple of years ago, it was $285 billion, and if it goes up to 4 or 5%, which it is doing now as we speak in the States, their interest payments to China go up to $845 billion, $845, and that pays for 4 times the military force in total. People's Liberation Army for China, paid for entirely by American citizens. And so we've got large interest payments coming out of this that we have to look at. And along with that goes the interest rates. Carbon tax credits, also included in here, they're increasing the carbon tax credits from $10 a ton to $50 a ton by the year 2020. And if that's the level universal playing board for all countries, then okay, we have to do what we have to do. But it's not. Mexico doesn't have that. So you folks in Alberta that are trying to ship natural gas, you got this $50 per ton extra cost on a commodity like salt, sugar, gold that Mexico doesn't have. And so if I want to buy my gas, where am I going to buy it from? And that's what you're faced with if we do this in isolation. Solar being installed in one of our small towns in BC. They're putting in solar power panels on top of the public works yard. Small story, but they're putting 110 solar power panels, and they expect that the surplus will go to BC Hydro, and a credit will come back to the town for going through the effort of putting up the solar power panels. It's just one more indicator that fossil fuels, chip by chip by chip, drip by drip, our demand is reducing. Condo flippers, another tax being checked out here is that in our province we have a lot of pre-sales with the rise of interest rate appreciation of properties. Increasingly more people than have been for years buying the pre-sale contract prices, and then before the closing flip it to a buyer who's actually going to move in, and have been pocketing the difference but not declaring it. And so now they've got the audits out on that and tracking people down, and that will not go well. Canada's not managing its risk for farmed salmon, and not a big story, just as a $1 billion salmon industry that we have for farming salmon in our province. It's a large thing. The concern is that here and in the Atlantic provinces, the salmon are getting released into the wild, and that has some ecosystem concerns, and so what to do about it. NAFTA deal, they expect to be done within a few days if they can just get these new auto rules sorted out, all about content, etc. Trump wanted this thing all wrapped up by next month, and it looks like he may get his way. But keep your ears peeled for this falling into place. But you can see the heat's building up. There's more and more people coming to the table on both sides at a higher level, dotting I's and crossing T's. So I wouldn't expect that to happen, not to happen very shortly. Yahoo, the old company, just paid a $35 million fine for a 2014 data breach, and just a small indicator that data security, data privacy. New restrictions on fisheries to protect endangered whales. Gulf of St. Lawrence, here we have fishermen take their ropes and lobster pots, drop them over the side, get the lobster, ship them to China. But the ropes are getting tangled up increasingly, and the growing, depleting herd, about 450 whales left out there, and they're constantly getting caught up and dying with the lobster ropes wrapped around them, and they're all those nylon stuff, they just never break down. And so it's a sad situation, and they're trying to put some very strict sanctions and rules in place about how to put your pots, run your lines, etc., to contain some of the danger that's taking place to the whales. This story was interesting on the pharmacists. They're pleading guilty to secret commissions. They've taken over $300,000 in commissions in from pharmaceutical companies, and they accept these incentives from multiple pharmaceutical companies. They say it's a common practice in the industry. It used to be among medicine. You had pharma reps come by, sit in the waiting room, and meet with the doctor afterwards, take them out golfing, buy them perks, just to get them a script to promote that particular drug over all other drugs. And there's a role in that. I mean, I'm not putting it down. You need to have that lobbying to educate the doctors or educate the pharmacists, because they don't have time to read all the stuff that's popping out every day, like this new vaccine we just talked about for syphilis. They need to be brought up to speed. But the actual giving of donations, gifts, and trips, and one thing or another, I know the medical group got rid of that after coming into the light flashed on it. So I'm surprised the pharmacists are still doing it. And that raises what we talk about this week of ethics and one thing or another. How ethical is it for pharmacists to accept under the table gifts of any proportion and then promote, push as generic or otherwise these favored drugs? And so besides just taking it, not declaring it to their bosses, is also the aspect of ethics, I think. Worth a talk. Mitel shares are soaring on a privatization. Mitel, you recall, was a very wonderful little company. I had some shares in it when it first broke out, and now they're taking it private again. Worth looking at. Tim Hortons is interesting. We talked about Starbucks, and Tim Hortons are putting together a new plan to improve Tim Hortons. Some things pop out of that story. Basically, they're trying to rewrite their strategy to improve the engagement, the experience for the customers, much like Starbucks does with wingback chairs and nice music and dark tones and coming in and sit with your friends for a while. They're trying to get the same sort of atmosphere going as their new strategy. But the challenge for them as they try to transition to this new, they're meeting with some opposition. They call it the Great White North Franchise Association. A lot of the franchises are owned by Canadians, and then it morphed into the States. And so there's some opposition to this extra spending and making money and trying to appease them. And that's one of the things concerns. We talk about modes of entry, and one of the modes of entry is to franchise your particular product line or service. And the danger of that is that, yes, it's a fast way to grow it. Use other people's money. You do turnkey operations. You get it all up. You put your franchise agreements in place, and you take a piece for royalty, a piece for advertising, and a piece for research and development off the paycheck. Everything's controlled by computers. You know every hamburger that's sold instantly at the head office. But the challenge is that if you decide to make some changes in those contracts, you can't do them unilaterally, globally. And so if you're a global franchise company, it's really difficult to change your strategies quickly without getting sign-off by all your partners now who have contracts with you, who may not be in a rush to change to this new strategy. And so it's a lesson learned to watch Tim Hortons and see what they encounter. A poll took place in Quebec that people should at least have the basic knowledge of French. A very high proportion, 77, 73, 79% of Quebec folks say that if you don't have a basic knowledge of French, you can't stay in Quebec. And my response to that, of course, is that I take the position that Canada belongs to each and every one of us. Quebec, I own a piece of Quebec. Quebec owns a piece of BC. And I don't think they have the right to say you can't come in. In fact, when we looked at this decades ago about the possibility of Quebec separating, you'll find that Quebec, the traditional old Quebec, Upper Canada, and Lower Canada in this case, runs a small strip of land up the St. Lawrence, but everything north of that, the Labrador area, all belonged initially to the Brits and came to Canada under the BNA Act and is part of Canada. And we gave it to the Quebec, to that province for administration, etc. And so it's part of, when you see it on the map, it's part of Quebec. But certainly if separation or these sort of rules were to take place, then I suspect I'd stand there and say, if you don't mind, I want that piece back into Canada. And the First Nations want a big chunk of it too, because in that stuff along the waterway, First Nations would have some claims against. So it's not something we should be doing, is trying to divide and say only Quebecers and people speak French can come into the province. But no wrong or right answers in this class. Why don't we have a good discussion on that? Air Canada wants, a pilot wants to be reinstated after alleged gender dispute. And this is all about human rights again. Well, that was an interesting story. I didn't get on the front page, I guess. Yeah, Camosun, I want to talk about that too. The human rights way, this is interesting. Camosun's one of the small universities here in Victoria, was a college. But they failed 3 nursing students. And the 3 nursing students went through the normal appeal process within the institution, first to the director, and then to the dean, and then to the vice president, and at each level got rejected. You're failed. And then they took human rights, and human rights came back and said, Camosun, you got to get in step with the federal and provincial legislation on human rights and sexual violence and sexual harassment, etc. We don't know what the offense is, but they received a fail grade, and so they were told they had to redo it all. So they've now been allowed to stay in the process, stay in the university and finish, and they're now looking for a new reality, new ways to handle appeals, which may include on issues like this, you'd have the right to take it externally to the university for another university to adjudicate on your dispute. And Justina is one of our clients. She's a lawyer here in our class. And it seems to me that, although not under the Sales Goods Act necessarily, but you're buying a service from the university, and it seems to me that you have a right, if you're not happy with the product, not happy with the service, what are your remedies? How do you get your money back? It shouldn't be just a matter you failed, goodbye. If there's something defective in the product that you're not getting what you bargained for, it seems to me that you should have some way for recourse, and we haven't done that in the universities yet. Class actions, whatever it happens to be, but if you ran in, say, to a cluster of bad courses that you didn't think you're getting your value for money, I think you should have a voice and you should be able to get a return of funds. But that's just one opinion. I could be right or wrong, but certainly worth a discussion. But a new mental model for universities for education, that you're responsive to your customers. Certainly, I view you folks as my customers. Macron pushes Trump on Iran and Syria. Again, we talked last week briefly about Macron and what he's doing, and he's rising at, as I said last week, the idea of the European Union. You had at the initial, France was there as the puppet master. Germany was the large, but didn't want to be seen as the puppet, as running the organization because of its fear of charismatic leaders and one thing or another. And over time, Germany came up to be the European Union and set the rules in the game and was the heavyweight. And what I see happening these days is France is reemerging as the strategic leader for the European Union, and he's doing much what same things Trump's doing over there. He's being hard. It was only 2-3 years ago that the previous presidents of France, they had 80% tax, and they were driving out all their very rich people to Brussels and other places because they couldn't afford to live in France. And so he's coming in and he's shaking the place up. He's trying to reset a new strategy for the country. And as a result of that, he's got a lot of pushback from strikes, the sense of entitlement. Don't have to work the same number of hours as, say, you and I work, and with the vacations and one thing or another and the pay and jobs for life. In fact, I recall 2 years ago there was a survey of students graduating from in some of the French institutions, and they said, what do you want to do upon graduation? And it was like over 90% of them said, I want to work for government. Well, who were your innovators, your entrepreneurs to make that whole country go ahead if everybody wants to work for government? And that's not to take away from government, but it needs to be in balance. But in France's case, 2 or 3 years ago, the way forward was to get a government job and you were made for life, and the entrepreneurs paid 80% tax and left the country. And so he's trying to put this back together. And so he's with Trump and said some great things on Iran and Syria, but he also called spades spades. He stood up to Trump and said on the environment and the Paris Accord, etc., be nice to have you back. And he said it in front of the whole Congress, and they gave him standing ovations. So watch Macron. I enjoy him. We apologize to the Chinese community about discriminatory policies through the 50s with the Chinese from head taxes and things of that, and couldn't apply. But I mean, it wasn't unusual. They were saying they couldn't have civic employment in Vancouver up to 1952 because they were Chinese. Swimming pools, cemeteries couldn't be buried in. In fact, here we still have Chinese-only cemeteries in Victoria, as historically you can see them. And so there's lots there, this unconscious bias we talk about. But it's not just to Vancouver. I recall in the city of Halifax, when I was in the Army there, you had Africaville, which was on the north part of the city of Halifax. It was the finest land. It was right in the harbour, etc., etc. But the government came in eventually and said, you're out of here, and moved them over to Porter's Lake, and that land got taken by developers, and now the large homes and views of the harbour, etc., are all there and taken over. But they had the same thing. Africaville didn't have any plumbing, any sewer, any water, and it was just like a clean line in the sand where it all stopped for the city. And it was just the wrong way to treat people. And we didn't say enough about it at that time. And so good to see we're cleaning things up today a little bit. ICBC, the Crown-owned organizations in the province here are basket cases. ICBC, BC Hydro, BC Ferries. The Crown takes back for general revenues, I'm just grabbing a number, the difference for each organization, but in the range of $500 million every year they put back into general revenues, so it's like a hidden tax on the people using the services, and then complain that the company's not making any money. And so ICBC has got this mammoth wall on what to do, and so they said what we're going to do is pass legislation that will limit the amount of that you can claim. So if it's a minor motor vehicle accident, the limit is $5,000 is what you can get, or $5,500 is what you can get in damages, and no more can come in and get all those pain and sufferings and specific damages and extra things that we used to get. They say it'll save them about $1 billion a year that they're going to take away from people who may be injured and keep it in the coffers of ICBC by a stroke of a pen. And that certainly was troubling, but we could look at that. The booze thing, the liquor thing in New Brunswick, the case, the way that went, it was interesting that on its face, the law seems to say that anything grown in one province can be taken without tariffs and barriers to the other province. That sounds good. But the minute you apply that to the oil situation, can Alberta bring the oil from one province to another if there shouldn't be any impediment, all of a sudden we've got it. And the answer to this seems to be, they went on and said that if it's for a higher purpose, then like protecting health safety or controlling the supply of liquor, then it might be all right to put the impediment in place. And so it seems to me that's not the rule of law the way I understand it. There was a Benjamin Cardozo, he was a jurist in the States, a very famous one. And but I was struck by his comment. He said, the law is what I say it is. And sitting on the bench, of course, he could say that. And that's what strikes me here, is that the legislature is saying that we'll make the law what I say it is to meet the circumstances, rather than say here, these are the law, the rules of monopoly. Well, I think I'm going to close on that. I have one little thing here, just a few more seconds. Foreign Affairs' latest edition came out. and reading through it, I've told you how much I enjoy the book. I'm just going to read a couple of passages if I can, because it's fascinating, but it validates everything we've been talking about in this course. And it's written by Susan Lund and Laura Tyson. Lund's a partner with McKinsey Group, and Laura Tyson is chair of the White House Council for Economic Advisors with the Clinton Group. But she says globalization is on the retreat. Cross-border financing flows have fallen. This is since 2008, down there. Since 2008, the Global Trade Alert, the G20 companies, have implemented more than 6,600 protectionist measures, and we've talked about that. People are walking away from trade agreements. Where before it was Western-led by the States, by Britain, these sort of countries, with Thatcher and subsequently by Reagan, that's shifting to China right now, and other emerging economies are taking the pole position on this new globalization. Where before we took advantage of cheap labor, that's slowing down. We're not doing that because robotics and things are coming in. It goes on to say, I'm going to keep skipping over if I can, certain sectors are going to fade away, certain jobs will disappear, and new winners will emerge. And that the drivers of globalization that we talk about, of low transportation and communications and new multilateral trade agreements, all took off at that period, but now they're contracting back down. And then go on to talk about digital flows. It's email and video stemming from file sharing, Internet of Things. The movement of data is surpassing traditional physical trade as a connective tissue in the global economy. And it goes on, Cisco Systems talking about half of all trade and global services now depend on digital technology one way or the other. Companies can cut their losses on goods in transit by installing sensors in shipment, 30% or more. We had that in one of our reports. I hope it gets up on the site for you to read. By using sensors, it was Maersk, I think, using it. Also, they can reach consumers around the world without going through retail shops, which you can get. It goes on and says, be prepared, what you can do to get ready. From at the country level, they need to put it top of their policy agenda. They need to have high-speed broadband network set up. Need to create incentives for companies to invest in new digital technologies and human capital that it's going to require. Digital literacy is going to become paramount. Schools will have to be reset to think their curricula to emphasize digital skills. For example, introducing computer coding in elementary school, requiring basic engineering and statistics in secondary school. We've talked about the importance in this class of analytics, and that's important to you. Just what I've, for those that heard from me, the analytics of the course and your participation didn't take too long to dig out and then use that knowledge, that data with evidence and make your position. The trick is to strike the right balance between balancing individuals' rights and remaining open to digital flows. And right now that pendulum, as we talked about with Facebook, etc., it's way distorted. It has to be brought back into line. The goal should make it easier to take where the jobs are, that we should allow the people from Newfoundland one time only give money to move to Vancouver, if that's where the jobs are, to get them retrained and up. Because we're going to have to, Rick, remember that chart I showed you where the 20% of the jobs will be on that empathy, the critical thinking, etc., and some of these digital skills. That's where we have to train those factors of endowment, the advanced factors endowment Porter talks about. We have to get them in position, so no use sitting on Vancouver or on Newfoundland. If it's not there, we need to take you over here and get you educated and back into the game as we do it. For companies, what you can do is serious challenges to the private sector, cyber attacks, invest more in digital technology, including automation, artificial intelligence, advanced analytics, in order to remain competitive. Develop your own digital capabilities in partnering or acquiring digital players. Companies need a strong local presence and a differentiated strategy in markets where they compete. It requires strong relationships and governments that are committed to corporate social responsibility. This is a great magazine, 7-8 pages per article, and well worth your time reading, and the font's big for us old farts. I'd recommend it to you. Anyway, folks, I hope you enjoyed today. We had a good session, and look forward to talking more with you this week. Bye-bye now.